Hey everyone,
hmm
thanks for joining. Today I am speaking with Izabella Tabarovsky. Isabella is a senior advisor at the Cannon Institute at the Wilson Center, and she's also a fellow at the Center for Contemporary Antisemitism, and she's written in Tablet and Newsweek. Hi, Isabella. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I reached out to you, and we'd spoken earlier before, and we were kind of speaking about similarities between what you saw in Soviet Russia and what you're seeing on the campuses. I brought you back on. If I asked you to come back on, if you wanted to speak about, we can talk about Israel and Palestine in general, like ever since like the war that started on October 7th, but also if we could focus a little bit on the reaction in the West, especially like on campuses and stuff, and among the younger generation.
Yeah, I mean, the reaction has been insane. Honestly, I think I've written quite a bit about Soviet anti-Zionism, Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda, and the reason I was writing about it was not out of some kind of, purely historical interest, even though it's interesting to me. Excuse me. And also, I am from there, and so as I was doing research on this, I felt a little bit like I was working through my own, like processing my own experiences in the Soviet Union. But the reason I was really writing about it is because I was seeing already a few years ago the danger of the discourse that was taking hold in the United States on campuses and elsewhere. This demonization of Israel, demonization of Zionism, complete departure from the real meaning of Zionism, and really kind of the entry into conspiracy theory territory. And what I used to write about was how under the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union, when I was growing up, when this rhetoric took hold, you started to have an effect on Jews, a very real effect. There were Soviet Jews had their educational and professional opportunities reduced. They were all under suspicion. It was very hard for Soviet Jews to travel abroad. I mean, it was hard for everyone, but at least if you were not Jewish, it was easier for you to secure a permission to travel. If you were Jewish, it was much harder because you were viewed as unreliable, untrustworthy, potentially an asset for the Mossad. So there were all these things there. And then October 7th came, and you already could see it happening in the US. It was already happening, where, Jewish professors, for example, who were Zionist, or Jewish students who were Zionist would face really aggressive attitudes or even have professional consequences at work. And in the publishing industry, you could see it. It was hard to publish, increasingly hard to publish books that took a pro-Israel position, for example, or questioned some of the anti-Zionist dogmas. And then October 7th happened. And my gosh, I realized that I mean, I was just flabbergasted by everything that happened. And I certainly did not see the support for Hamas coming. It was not in my book. I did not foresee it, and I'm still processing it. I think, like a lot of other people, and in fact, as we speak, I'm kind of writing an essay, like a million other people, trying to help analyze and explain it. But yeah, it's utterly shocking.
Like on my end, I started noticing it. Okay, I mean, anti-Semitism has been around for a long while, so I'm not going to say I just started noticing anti-Semitism in 2018. But I started noticing it from the quote unquote progressive left, the ones who said they wanted to be anti-racist. And that was when I was starting really reading into intersectionality and critical race theory and trying to figure out what this stuff was. I noticed on Twitter, you would see, oh, Anne Frank was just a white woman and she's using a white woman's tears. You'd
Right.
see that kind of
Right.
stuff. So this Jews have white privilege, Jews are white. So I noticed it from that angle. Um, I saw that coming
Mm.
in. And since 2014, since I got back from overseas, I was dealing with the far left, you know, Islamophilia. Like I criticize the hijab. I'm a white supremacist, you know, that kind of stuff. And then you look at the left's or the hard left's love of Islam, or at least allying with Islam, and then them classifying Jews as white. Now, I told a couple of people I knew one's a professor at Rutgers, a couple others. They, have Substacks and things. And I told them, I think I told them this in like 2019, maybe 2020. I said, give it a couple of years and you're going to see Jews of color. You're going to see that the only people who can face anti-Semitism are quote unquote Jews of color. And I mean, we're pretty much at that. Like, and so
you're spot on, spot on.
When I saw this happen, I wasn't surprised by the support of the Palestinians, because again, you look at the theories that they're following, like the intersectionality theories. So who's more oppressed? So Palestinian, they see Islam as a brown religion. They see Judaism as a white religion. So browns are oppressed, whites are oppressors. But then you also look at it through the lens of post-colonialism. And so, Jews are the colonizers. And so I saw it from that way. So I wasn't surprised with the support for the Palestinians. I was surprised a little bit at how far they were supporting Hamas. Like,
Right.
even, there was no real support of ISIS. They might have said ISIS has nothing to do with Islam or whatever and defend Islam that way, but they never said, well, what ISIS is doing is good.
Right.
Here they're defending what Hamas is saying. So that surprised me a little bit, but the support for the Palestinians didn't. The open anti-Semitism didn't. I mean,
Yeah.
Like, okay, look at my country. So we've got a woke prime minister, as woke as you can get. We've got policies based on Kendi anti-racism. Our foreign service is taught that things like professionalism, punctuality, like that whole list, that's all white supremacy culture. Our Ministry of Immigration defines white privilege as if you have ideas that uphold white supremacy, you have white privilege regardless of your skin color or race. So that's in our government. We hired a guy, so he's still on contract as far as I know with the Canadian government. But we hired him to teach anti-racism to our national broadcaster, the CBC. From the day he became a Canadian citizen, he's called Canada a colonizing state and settler colonialism, all this stuff. He's living in Lebanon. He was going to teach them remotely because it was during COVID. And this guy, there were tweets that everyone, people who knew about it looked at it. He was under investigation by our CSIS, which is kind of like our FBI. He was like, death to the white supremacist Jews. I mean, all kinds of stuff like that. But because he was teaching anti-racism, he was hired. So I saw the reaction to the Palestinians didn't surprise me. The anti-Semitism didn't really surprise me because it was based on hate of whiteness, and Jews now have whiteness, so it was okay. But yeah, the support of Hamas, as far as they went, that was a bit of an eye opener for me.
Yeah. I mean, you're very mild about it. I mean, a bit of a surprise. The thing is, the support for Palestinians also did not surprise me. That's been kind of the big rallying cry for the left for a very long time. And again, because I come from the perspective of, I understand the Soviet perspective really well, and I am intimately familiar with the texts that they put out, including for the global left and for the developing world in multiple languages, from 1967 onward until the country fell apart. They flooded their kind of their sympathizers in the West with ideas about Israel and Zionism that are exactly what the left is saying today. And I think that while I don't necessarily think that, that there are those who view and believe, based on some sources, that the Soviets actually invented the Palestinian identity and all that, I don't buy into it. I think that the sources people use are pretty flimsy for that. But I think, and I don't even necessarily, look, the Soviets didn't invent everything, but what they were really good at was kind of putting it all together as a piece of mosaic, and creating kind of a unified theory of Zionism and Israel as the most evil and dangerous state, and then kind of multiplying it or using like multiplier effects and pushing it out to everybody else, replaying it to everybody else. So they would borrow ideas from the Western left. They would borrow ideas from the Arab intellectuals and Arab propaganda, and then they would just tie it all together, together with their own ideas. And I think what the Soviets did was turn the Palestinian cause into the rallying cry for the left. And since then, the USSR is gone, but that language is left and the Palestinian cause is left. And I think that today, the Palestinian cause is pretty much the only cause that the left has. I mean, the left has really no other causes. I think everything else is so, I don't know, like all of this language of decolonialism. That's also, I was growing up in the USSR. It was already old. This language was already old. The anti-racist language is okay. That's a slight variation on the left's general anti-racism, but they've taken it to the extreme. But as a cause, I think that the Palestinian cause is the only one, and that's why they hold on to it with such sort of so hard. They can't let it go. I think if you remember in 2015, it was Patrice Cullors. I always mispronounce her name. The co-founder of the Black Lives Matter. She said that if we lose Palestine, we're done for, something like that. This is like our main moral cause. So, when you turn something into a cause, you disconnect from the reality of that situation. And the left is really disconnected from the reality of Israel Palestine completely. So all of that is just a long kind of, riff on their support for Palestine. So that didn't surprise me. But it's really, I mean, there is actually a difference. We can argue to what extent Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank support Hamas, but there is still a difference between supporting Palestinians versus supporting Hamas and celebrating the just unbelievable crimes that they committed. I mean, that to me is really a sign that the left has lost its moral core, truly.
And I don't like these terms left, right? At least in a North American sense, they've lost all meaning.
They've lost all meaning.
But yeah, I mean, like the hard left, the woke left, whatever you want to call them, it's morality based off of they're running a program. Like if it goes against their matrix and intersectionality, then it's oppressor. If it doesn't, then it's oppressed. So they're just running off that. So yeah, they don't really have, like, they do have, like, that's their guiding principle, but they don't really have a morality. Like, they don't see if the outcome is good or bad. Now,
right.
We can get into the argument if you want, but like, the whole thing with like Abraham willing to kill his son. So, oh, well, it's good because God saved the kid, but it's like, okay, but he was willing to kill his son. So I'm thinking, like, you can have a morality discussion around that. Whereas with them, the morality discussion is, are you oppressed or oppressor? And that defines it for them. So, and part of what I'm seeing here is it's like a mixture of Frantz Fanon with Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance. So Fanon's like, okay, the only way the oppressed can feel good is if they oppress their oppressor for an equal amount of time. And, in the start of the prelude to Wretched of the Earth, Sartre writes about bathing in European blood and stuff. I mean, and then you have the repressive tolerance where it's not good enough just to give a voice to the oppressed. You have to suppress the voices of anyone who might harm the oppressed, right? So you mix those two ideas together, and that's where you get this love of Hamas. So I don't know. I've been saying it since I got back. I'm like, you're going to get weird reactions. You're going to get overcorrections. You're all kinds of, and we're not going to be able to defend ourselves because we've stripped away our defenses. Like the ADL. Yes, they came out and they spoke out against Hamas. They spoke out against all these people in the States who are pro Hamas. But now, like, I'm reading some of their stuff, and they want to use DEI to help combat anti-Semitism, or they want DEI departments to have anti-Semitism listed underneath their thing.
Right.
Okay. So no, you haven't learned your lesson. You didn't learn that the stuff that was being pumped out of universities is what caused this anti-Semitism. Now you want to use more of it to create, to fight anti-Semitism. So it's more that they lost their moral center. It's more that they decided to use a different set of rules to get their, if you want to call it morality, get their morality from, or their ethic from.
Right. Well, the ADL, I know that everybody criticizes them, left and right. And I think that they are, they're not as bad as a lot of people portray them because, I know some people who work for it. I do think that they have definitely strayed too far to the left at some point. And I think that they now are trying or have been trying for a couple of years to kind of pedal back into the center. I know for a fact that Johnson Greenblatt did realize it at some point. But it's hard for them. I mean, what people are kind of losing sight of is that they think that somehow the progressive left, I think people get confused by terminology. There's so much confusing terminology in this. Progressive sounds good, anti-racist sounds good, and nobody really looks into the, equity sounds good, and people don't really look into the real meaning of these words. Meanwhile, this ideology is non-liberal. This is what people don't understand. Non-liberal in the sense that not, again, like left or right, or for the people who are left of center, liberals should really understand, if you want to stay left of center, this is not, you're now moving into the totalitarian territory. You're moving into an ideology that wants to control things. It wants to control your thoughts. It wants to control your speech. You're no longer in the liberal territory. And I think that's why a lot of us feel like the ground has shifted under our feet. I used to consider myself a liberal. In a way, I still do, but not according to the definitions of contemporary political landscape, because everything has become so far left. I can't call myself that in that regard. So it's it's just everybody and everything has become really confused.
Okay, that's one thing about this, the confusion. So there's so much noise, and it's kind of hard to get a good picture. So I wanted to ask you a couple of things, and if you don't know, I mean, I understand, but so a lot of this stuff you hear, because I read into it, or I try to read as much as I can and from as many different places as I can. But okay, Israel's been doing an ongoing genocide on the Palestinian population. I'm like, well, the Palestinian population is it's like tripled or something like that in the last 20 years. If you want to take a few of those that you've heard and then maybe try to give the other side of it, so like I said, like the genocide thing, or apartheid state, that kind of stuff. And then like I said, give the other side if you can.
Well, sure, I can do that. I want to preface it by saying again that this language comes from propaganda, which means that, the people who use it don't really want facts. Now I understand that we're not, we're speaking to people who want facts. So we're not speaking to the radicals. We're speaking to people who actually are hearing these things and think that there is something real behind them. The fact that there isn't anything real behind it, you just said it, the Palestinian population has, grown in multiples since 1948, if you take it from the beginning, from the establishment of the State of Israel, so that's clearly not a genocide. Right now, what's happening now, what is a genocide? A genocide has an intention. I mean, there's a legal definition to it. And one of the key aspects of whether something is a genocide or not is whether there is an intention. And so there is some argument right now among scholars of genocide as to the intention. I mean, I think it's completely wrong to assign the Israelis and the IDF an intention to commit a genocide in Gaza. What we have now is a war with civilian casualties, and the number of actual civilian casualties, we don't know, because the Hamas Ministry of Health reports total number of casualties. So even if we assume that it's right, we still don't know how many of them are members of the Hamas. So we don't know how many of them are actually fighting the IDF. So that's number one. Number two is you just have to look at the extent to which the IDF is trying to avoid civilian casualties, to understand that there is no intention of the genocide. So there is a difference. Hamas, on the other hand, came in with a specific plan to annihilate as many Jews as possible. So it was an intention. There was an intention to commit a genocide. And they have said again and again that they will not stop at October 7th, that they will want to continue. And every time they have an opportunity, they will come in and repeat what we saw on October 7th. So you can see the difference in the intention there. So that's what, with regards to genocide. With regards to apartheid, that's also that accusation also, by the way, comes from Soviet propaganda, just like the accusation of genocide. The accusation of apartheid begins in the 1960s when the Soviets start to compare Israel to South Africa and say that Israelis treat Palestinians the way white South Africans treat Black South Africans. And they do it because, first of all, they see that Israel is reaching out and building relations with African countries, and it's trying to stop that because the USSR sees Africa as its kind of playing ground, and it doesn't want anybody else to come in and compete with them. And part of the reason is also to smear Israel. After 1967, they really, after Israel defeats Soviet Arab allies, it makes it a priority to fight Israel and to fight Zionism internationally. It really constructs this conspiracy theory about Zionism, that Zionism is this global force that stands against Soviet interests and socialist interests. And so they just paint it in every shade of black that they can find. If you look at the reports that the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch put out, they both rely on a changed definition of apartheid. They both rely on circular reporting, meaning that they quote each other. They quote experts that seem to be independent, but in reality are all connected to them. They take all agency away from Palestinians. So it's only Israel that's acting. It's only Israel acting in the region and creating conditions that are unfavorable to Palestinians. And so you read those reports and you imagine that Israel, by the way, Soviet propaganda did exactly that. They would report on events in the Middle East. They would omit Palestinian actions. They would omit reports or instances of Palestinian terrorism and only report the IDF's reaction. And so you think, wow, these Israelis, they just bomb Palestinians for fun. They wake up in the morning and they're so bloodthirsty, they go and kill Palestinians. So it's the same when you read these reports from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. It's as though Israel is just acting, doing all these terrible things just for the sake of it, as opposed to out of security concerns or as a response to something that the Palestinians did. So it's just a completely unrealistic portrayal of reality. And I think that a lot of it, there are all kinds of motivations there, but you can see that the paradigm in all of it is that they have already constructed a view of Israel, and everything they do has to fit into this view. Nothing they ever say will challenge this overarching view. And this overarching view is, yet again, that Israel is a state that was born illegitimately, that it's a crime unto itself, that it doesn't have a right to exist. It's evil, more evil than anything else created under the sun. And so then everything they do needs to be proving that thesis.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things in there. So when you talked about the Soviet allies in Africa and the MENA region, that's one thing I always try to point out. This is not a one-sided thing where it's the left in the West that is becoming Islamophilic. Islam has had its relations with socialism and communism as well. I mean, during the Cold War, Libya and Syria were definitely allies with the Soviet Union. Iran had some dealings with them, even though they were under an embargo. But Iran, if it wasn't for communist students, you wouldn't have had the Ayatollah. You wouldn't have had the Ayatollahs win the revolution. They needed the communist students, and as soon as they were done with them, they killed them all. Same thing with the Baathists in Iraq. They needed the communists, right? So there was,
yeah.
So yeah, Islam has also had that. Islam is also, whether they're using them as useful idiots or you do have some like legitimate similarities, like okay, comrade, and in Islam they call everyone brother or sister. And it's that sense of community, it's that sense of, if you listen to some of the softer stuff about the Ummah and how the community is all supposed to be together and look after one another and all that, right? You have to look after all Muslims, and that's, they kind of use that as a rallying cry for the Palestinians every now and then. They use the Palestinians as a rallying cry to get the Muslims together. So they there has been that connection. So
The Red Green Alliance, right?
yeah,
That's as
and
it's known. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, I look at it and I can understand why someone like Linda Sarsour in the States will be a sponsor for Bernie Sanders. Like
Yeah, totally.
it's ridiculous, but
Totally.
like
Well, and
what
it's not just Islam, it's radical Islam, because this is what you saw the Soviets support. They supported, what's called Islamism, I guess. They supported Palestinian terrorism. They trained Palestinian terrorists. The GDR financed the Palestinian terrorists. So it's up to that level. So that's a whole different. That's already a different level, I would say, than just support for Islam. I mean, that by itself could be benign, but and it's also really interesting because, of course, inside the country, inside the USSR, you couldn't practice Islam. You couldn't basically practice any religion. But outside the country was a whole different story, which just tells you that it was all political. And again, support for the radical Islamic causes is really it shows that it was just a tool for the Soviets during the Cold War to use against the West or against whatever that it wanted to attack in its opponents' structures.
I don't know. Have you ever read Nick Cohen's book What's Left?
No, I'm
So
familiar with it, but
yeah,
like I've heard about it. But is it
yeah. So
good?
he talks about that. He talks about how the Marxist left after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had nowhere else really to go, so they glommed onto anti-imperialism. And so,
Mm.
the U.S. was imperialistic and had, it's spreading an empire through war and commerce and capitalism, blah 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 blah. So they glommed onto that. So you had the first Gulf War, so they were anti-war because it's imperialistic aspirations. But if you look at the letter that to Osama bin Laden that all these Gen Zs are approving, but that was the same kind of talk that the anti-imperialist left after, like the Marxists left that became anti-imperialist. So what bin Laden was talking about, how the U.S. has come in, they've taken over our holy lands, they've conquered our lands, this and that, like it was sort of like it was another crusade. So that was another connection point for them, at least out here. It's like, oh yes, see, this is an empire. We're helping fighting empire. We're protecting the poor brown people from the white imperialists, and it's.
Well, what's interesting is that for me, again, there is nothing new in that either. I mean, this is what I completely like. I just feel so perplexed by this whole discourse right now, because on the one hand, it's being sold as new, but on the other hand, this all existed in the USSR also. So I feel like they're all just using old, kind of old prefab kind of ideas that were already there. Because, already in the early 70s, the Soviets were saying that Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. Everything for them, like, I mean, I think in a way, maybe you could say that in their propaganda, they covered the entire gamut of left-wing slogans and left-wing causes, because they were trying to really create I guess, a big tent coalition of everybody who could join them, in the Cold War, so that they could undermine their opponent from the inside. So, so they would compare what Israel was doing to Palestinians, for example, to the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War was a really big cause for the Western left. So it would glom on to, and then anti-racism was a big also cause for the Western left. And so then they would talk about Israelis as racist. So I think that they just, like everything that was important for the left, they just tried to pander to each of those causes so that they could amplify them and create connections, and create allies. And so maybe it could be the case that anything that the left says today, it's going to sound like something that Soviet propaganda already preached, because they really just used everything that the left ever had. I don't know, but it's really odd to me. I mean, to be honest with you, even this binary of oppressor and oppressed that a lot of people are kind of zeroing in on, I feel like, well, that's just your traditional Marxism. I mean, for the Bolsheviks, everything was also oppressor versus oppressed. It's just that the people who filled in these categories were different. For the Bolsheviks, it was, the proletariat versus the capitalist, or bourgeoisie or whatever. Today, they're doing it by skin color. So it's a different division, but it's still a very simplistic binary. I think that that's just how the left thinks.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, it's nothing new under the sun, but my thinking, this is my read on it, and it was, it was the thing by Deutschke there, the long march through the institutions. They started slowly.
Yeah.
I think the late 80s, early 90s was a real watershed moment, because that's when intersectionality came on the scene. And once you put that lens, yeah, you had anti-racism kind of stuff before. You had critical legal scholarship that was going on in the early 70s. You had all kinds of other stuff that was, post-colonialism was also coming out. But that intersectional lens what really did it. And I think by that point, the academy, just at least the humanities in the academy, started going in that direction. I mean, in the Kimberly Crenshaw, in her paper Mapping the Margins, she says it straight out that we need to get away from the liberal ethic and have a politics of identity. And so intersectionality was moving you away from Enlightenment values or liberal values, and
Yeah.
it
No,
was
it's
focusing on something different. So I think that's when that came in, and then slowly it started building. And by the 2000s, the academy was on this course of, teaching everything through the lens of oppressor and oppressed. And so, yes, so that's why, I mean, I don't get into the whole argument of, is it cultural Marxism? Is it, race Marxism, whatever. I don't bother with that. It's like, it's a totalitarian idea. They all
Yeah.
rhyme. They all have similar
Yeah.
methods. Okay. It's just the focus of the hate that's different. So let's just
Yeah.
focus on it that way. And then, all that other stuff, to me, it's a secondary or tertiary argument, and I'd rather focus on the main, what's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, no. I mean, I agree with you. Absolutely. It's the general kind of the framework, the looking at the world, the fundamental kind of worldview that's really problematic. The long march through institutions, that's an innovation, understanding that that the working class is not interested in the West, is not interested in you know orchestrating another October Revolution, and understanding that you have to undermine the institutions and values of the society, and using education to do that. I mean, that's really, I think that we've woken up too late to that. That's a real danger, because now you have a couple of generations of people who've been brought up that way, and they're radical, pretty radical.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to focus too much on that, but I saw some stuff. This was before October 7th, so it was mainly around the trans stuff, and there was these kids who were taking down the trans pride flags and stepping on them and whatever. And all these kids, the parents are saying, okay, well, kids shouldn't have been stepping on the flags, but at least they're not buying into the ideology, right? And they were like, oh, the next generation is going to be fine. And at the same time, there were some studies that came out, and so I think it was something like 65% of kids, like teenagers now, would be okay with cameras in the house monitoring everything. I'm like, so even if they're,
that's incredible.
yeah,
That's
so
incredible.
I'm like, even if they're opposed to the gender ideology, which I think is a little crazy, like I think the ideology is a little crazy. Being opposed to it, I think is normal, but they're still not liberal. They're not being taught liberal values.
Right.
So, you know, I when I started looking into this stuff and when I started looking at what was going on in K through 12 in parts of North America, I'm like, these are woke madrasas. Like, these are,
Right.
and it's not every kid that goes to a madrasa is going to join the Taliban or ISIS, but they're going to be the ones who are like the 98% in the UK that think homosexuality should be punishable by the law, like they should be imprisoned. So yeah, they're not ISIS, but they're very conservative Muslims, and they want some form of Sharia. So I was like, yeah, you've got woke madrasas going on, and
Right.
so even if they're not on board with the racism, anti-racism stuff, or the gender stuff, or whatever, they're picking up the tools of the authoritarianism, and that's how they think they should push their ideology. And
Well, that's what worries me the most. I'm very sensitive to that, coming from the society I come from. And I began to hear these notes in 2020, for the first time. I'm sure they were there before, I just wasn't paying attention, but 2020 is when it became really apparent to me. And that, I mean, that's really dangerous. The question that I have, maybe, and I wonder what you have, whether you've thought about it, is, how is it that it's become so widely adopted? Because, let's say in the USSR, I understand it comes like if you're in a society like that, you're in China, you're in a truly totalitarian state. Okay, it comes from the top. The government introduces it into all of the schools' curricula. Everybody is studying it together. How is it? Because it seems it's pretty decentralized in the US. So how is it that everybody suddenly, at the same time adopts these ideas?
um, okay, so it was slowly building, and it started getting off campus in 2012, 2013. It really started getting off campus around 2015. If you look at Zach Goldberg's work, I think it was on his thesis. He looked at like the uses of the terms racism and anti-racism and Islamophobia, and he looked at it was New York Times, Washington Post, L.A. Times, like a bunch of big newspapers in the States, and just graphed how the use of those terms were going. So it was fairly flat up until about 2008. Then it started going up. By Obama's second term, it had doubled. By Trump's first term, or like Trump's term, it had like tripled, and it was just going up exponentially, the use of these terms. So it was already in the air. Then you had social media, and then you had politicians. Like it was just, it was a loop that was feeding into itself. It was just one
Mm-hmm.
big giant feedback loop and so when you're calling attention to it, you're calling attention to it, and everyone's looking at it. And a lot of people just went along with it because it was, like you said, anti-racism sounds nice. On the face of it, Black Lives Matter sounds like a decent statement. No one has the time anymore to look into things. There's a ton of problems. Like if you look at parents in North America, if you let your kid walk, you know, on your street, go like 20 houses and go play in the park, one of your neighbors will call Child Protective Services, and you'll have the cops at your door. So you don't have time to look into things. You don't have time
Yep.
to find out about that. And so part of it is, I think Jonathan Rauch called it the humanitarian threat to liberal science. So they plug on, they tug on your heartstrings. Oh well, like
Yes.
don't you want to fight racism? Don't you want to fight homophobia and blah 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 blah? And everyone's like, yeah, I get on board
Exactly.
with it, and they don't know what's going on. Um,
Yep.
and so
Exactly. Mm-hmm. No,
then
go ahead.
George Floyd happened,
Yeah.
and you had a captive audience because of COVID lockdowns,
Yeah.
and then it really took off. So the amount of people I'm in my mid 50s, the amount of people my age group that all of a sudden started talking about Kendi and stuff like that, and started posting articles about how um, white people who live in trailer parks have it better off than professional black people, and all kinds of garbage like that. And so that was it. It was just, it had that moment where took that spark and it went with it, and it was already in the air. There was already, you'd have articles in New York Times pushing this garbage. Like there was
Yeah.
one where it was 4 black girls got beat up by 2 South Asian males, and the piece in the New York Times was how it was all about whiteness.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you remember in 29. Sorry, I'll just say this and I'll let you go. I'll let you
Mm.
speak. There was this rap. Okay, so it was 2019, I believe. It was Hanukkah. There was a whole bunch of attacks on synagogues and Jewish people during Hanukkah on 2019, like in the States. And the worst one was in the small town in upstate New York. I think a bunch of people in the synagogue got killed, and then the rabbi in his home got killed. And the article the next day was about how Jews should not succumb to whiteness. It was a black guy who killed them. So if they want to be upset that it was a black guy who killed them, don't talk about succumbing to whiteness. I mean, it's a little ludicrous here. And I'm not saying you go out and be racist against black people either, but at least say, okay, this was a black man who did it, so we should look at it. So yeah, it's
Right. Well,
yeah.
right. Like nobody wants to stay kind of connected to reality anymore. This whole issue of Jews and whiteness, if you look at the Israeli society, I mean, in general, this idea sounds really ridiculous because, of course, you know, if you come from a European society, if you come from like if you look at the history of German Jews, the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed because they were not white enough, they were not Aryan enough. And now all of a sudden, Jews are white, it's the most ridiculous thing. But if you look at the Israeli society, which is another thing, you asked me to debunk a few ideas with regards to Israel. This is another one that really deserves debunking. You hear the woke talk about Israel as a white supremacist state and Jews as white and Zionist supremacists. Well, Israeli society is majority Jews who came from Arab countries. They're exactly the same color as Palestinians. A lot of them actually speak Arabic, and then 25% of the Israeli society is Arabs. And so it's an extremely diverse society. And then there are Ethiopian Jews, so it's extremely diverse, and Ashkenazi Jews are actually in the minority now. And yet there is this myth that Israel is a white supremacist society. And as you say, nobody has time to look into it. But people rely on certain organizations that they have invested their trust in. So if the New York Times writes something, then it's true. If the Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International publish something, then it's true. I just heard a couple of interviews with Norman Finkelstein, which, if your audience doesn't know who this is, I don't want to get into it. However, what's really interesting, I mean, he's just a real far left crank, who calls Gaza a concentration camp and relies on reports from the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, quotes them as widely respected, honest organizations that produce honest reporting. Well, the Human Rights Watch right now is in the midst of a scandal. Two things have happened. So one is that a senior person there has just left. I think she's like an editor-in-chief of its publications or something like that. She sent a company-wide email before her departure in which she talked about how the Human Rights Watch just completely is destroyed professionally, got destroyed by its obsessive hatred of Israel. She talked about how there are no more standards, how everything is geared towards like expressing this hatred against Israel. And then number two is that a letter has just surfaced from, I can't remember the year, but maybe 10 years ago or so, or maybe less, about the Human Rights Watch getting funding from Qatar, secret funding from Qatar, millions of dollars. Qatar, of course, is a country that is home to Al Jazeera and that's home to the senior Hamas leadership. The Human Rights Watch at some point went dark in terms of its donors, and that's never a good sign. So, so who was funding these widely respected organizations? I mean, I just think that the Human Rights Watch used to be a widely respected organization when its founder ran it, and then he left and Ken Ross came in, who is obsessively anti-Israel. And so, but that's the thing. It's like these organizations run on the coattails of their past glory, and people haven't yet caught up because people don't have time to check anything. Going back to what you said, and I think that this is, if anything, I think we all need to learn that we're now living in a world where everything changes. The left and right categories, I completely agree with you, don't mean much. Old glory doesn't mean much. You have to really look into absolutely everything. You can't trust anything. You have to read every article. You have to research everything before you can form your own opinion. Otherwise, you become part of a crowd or a mob that's being led by somebody else and being used and weaponized for somebody else's agenda.
Yeah. Just a couple more things and I'll let you go because I don't want to keep you too long because I realize it's a lot later for you than it is for me. The first is like something you were talking about there. So I keep going back to Hitchens used to always talk about the play A Man for All Seasons. I don't know if you've seen the movie with Charlton Heston.
Mm-mm.
But there's a part in it where the church's inquisitor or lawyer or whatever is talking to Thomas More, and Thomas More says, well, you'd cut down the laws of England to catch the devil. And this guy Roper turns around and said, yep, I'll cut down every law in England if I have to catch the devil. And Thomas More replies back, well, what then? What will you do when the devil turns around and you've stripped all the laws bare? So that's one of the things that concerned me when I got back from overseas in 2014, and I'm still harping on it now, is we don't have defenses left. Like, right. So I'm in Canada. You can talk about what's going on here, but if you look in the States, like the ACLU is a shadow of what it used to be. How are they supposed to defend civil liberties?
They can't.
Yeah.
They can't.
So I'm afraid about the extremism, and I'm afraid about what's going to happen with overcorrections. We've got nothing left to defend ourselves. So I'd like to ask you about that. Second thing I'd like to ask you about is, where does Israel go after this? Like, it's losing support in the West with governments. There's a lot more pressure for ceasefires in Israel to stop. I personally say until you wipe out Hamas, don't stop. That's my take on this. Like, you can't let them. They told you straight out that they're not going to stop. So I don't see how Israel can stop. But so yeah, if you want to just talk about like that, like we've lost our protections in the West, or we've given them away, and a strong man can take control now. And then I said, they bring about Israel.
Well, I mean, first of all, I completely share your concern. I think that we've gone so far to the left and that's already dangerous, but the overcorrection may very well be to the far right. And I think that it's already happening in some places. It's happening in Europe. And, if it's just kind of average right, it's okay. But if it's really far right, then we may be in trouble. I think that I think I completely share your concern on this. And actually it's interesting that some socialists, kind of old-fashioned socialists, have warned the left, specifically with regards to the language that it uses about Israel and Zionism, which is very conspiracist, very just obsessive hatred kind of language. And they've said that if the left keeps traveling down this path, then it will lose its ability to fight the anti-Semitism on the extremist far right when the time comes to fight that. And they're completely right. It's already right now, in the moment in which we're recording this, it's impossible to tell the language of the far left from the language, the extreme left, from the language on the extreme right. And the extreme right is completely jumping on the bandwagon of this far left Islamist kind of carnival that we're watching right now, and the anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel hate. So I think it's a very, very, very big problem. As for Israel, I mean, look, I'm in Israel right now, and I was here on October 7th, and I can tell you that, yes, the pressure from outside is strong, and we'll see how the political leadership, how Netanyahu and the rest of them respond. But as far as, from the kind of the sense of the people, is that we have to destroy Hamas, because otherwise there will never be enough of a sense of security inside the country for the country to continue living, the way it did. I think that it's just the attack was so brutal that, and the expression of the will to continue doing it is so clear. And it's not the first time that Israelis see this kind of brutality from Palestinian terrorist organizations. It's just that this time it was so big, and it was so it was just massive, right? That Israelis just will not be able to continue unless they can see that Hamas is no longer presenting a threat to them. It's hard to say what will happen because, as you say, there is so much international pressure. But I just don't see like if Israel stopped right now, if it stopped fighting Hamas, I mean, I don't know. I think that there will be, I think that the society will, I think there'll be riots. I think that the army will fall apart. I think I've seen some Israeli analysts say that, that if we stop fighting now, then people will just quit the army. They will, in disgust, basically, in the sense that the army, not only did the army fail to protect the civilians on October 7th, but it's also now failing in its mission of further kind of protecting the society. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of unknowns here, obviously, but I think the very strong sense of the Israelis is that the army needs to finish the job.
Yeah, like I said, that's where my stance is too. Is you can't leave Hamas lying around. But then, okay, I'll just leave it with this: like, you can't leave Hamas lying around. You have to get rid of Hamas, but then the real work starts. Like,
well, you mean what's going to happen in Gaza after it's
okay.
gone?
I mean, I was looking at just the immediate of like getting rid of Hamas, but I'm just saying if you want to plan for that, like the real work does start after you get rid of Hamas, because going back to madrasas, you've got to, like what, 8 kids who've been going through schools for 18 years, and now we're learning also from like the UN, they were learning to like hate and despise Jews. It's just
right. Well, I mean, look, I don't know if you're familiar. Do you follow Einat Wilf at all? Do you know who she is?
No.
I highly, highly recommend her to follow her on X. She posts really excellent posts, and her book, The War of Return, which she co-authored with Adi Schwartz, is a big, big, big recommend from me. A must read in terms of understanding what this conflict is about. She constantly says that we have to give the Palestinians the respect of listening to what they tell us about what they want. And they have said to us over and over again, very, very clearly, that their priority is not to establish their own state. Their priority is to annihilate the Jewish state. This is their cause. This is their main grievance. They can't, like, if they agreed to having a state next to the Jewish state, they would have had this objective. They would have achieved this objective already decades ago. But, look, Gaza, here's to debunk one more myth, Gaza was not occupied. When October 7th happened, Gaza hadn't been occupied since 2015. Israel had completely left it in 2015. And when it left it, there were very big hopes for Gaza, that Gaza would become kind of this jewel on the Mediterranean. Lots of money, lots of people were willing to invest lots of money to build a port there, to make it a big tourist destination. But instead, they elected Hamas, and we have what we have. So the support for Hamas is very high. The support for the idea that Israel does not have a right to exist and needs to be wiped out is very high. And so, as you say, the real work will be re-educating the population, somehow de-radicalizing the population. We need, and Einat Wilf has talked about, we need to look at the Nazi example, or the German example, how did we de-radicalize the Nazi German population? I mean, this will be critical. Without it, there will never be peace in this region. There should be a Palestinian state, but it needs to be a state that says openly, yes, we are okay with there being a Jewish state, a sovereign Jewish state next to ours. If Palestinians want to return, this is speaking of the right of return, which is really the stumbling block in all of it, then they should be returning into the future Palestinian state, not into the sovereign state of Israel, all these millions of people. So I highly recommend reading her because she brings a lot of clarity into this issue.
Great, thanks. I'll check that out. It was really good talking to you, Izabella. Thank you very much for coming on.
Same here. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Always good to talk to you.
And thanks everyone for listening, and I'll be back.